Here's a nightmare I want you to actually sit in for a second. Imagine you wake up locked inside a psychiatric hospital, and every doctor there is completely convinced you're insane. You're not. You're as sane as you are right now. So what do? What could you possibly say to prove it? Think about the trap. If you stay calm and rational, they write down that you're controlled and in denial. If you get upset and insist you're normal, well, that's exactly what a crazy person would do. Every move you make just becomes more evidence for the label. The harder you fight to prove you're sane, the more insane you look. In 1973, 8 perfectly sane people walked into psychiatric hospitals on purpose to test that exact trap. And what happened to them became one of the most famous experiments in history. It shook psychiatry to its core. But there's a second twist, uncovered only recently, that's almost more disturbing than the first. The man who ran this whole experiment may have been lying about all of it. Today, both bombshells. Let's go in. The man was David Rosenhan, a psychologist at Stanford, and he wanted to answer a question so basic it was terrifying that no one had truly tested it. Can psychiatry actually tell the difference between someone who is sane and someone who is insane? Because if the experts, the trained doctors, couldn't reliably tell them apart, then the entire system of diagnosing, labeling, and locking people away rested on sand. So Rosenhan designed a bold, simple test. He recruited 8 completely normal, mentally healthy people, including himself. Their mission: get themselves admitted into psychiatric hospitals by faking a single, tiny symptom. And then, the moment they were inside, drop the act entirely, behave exactly like their normal selves, and see one thing: how long it would take the professionals to realize they were perfectly sane. The results, published in the prestigious journal Science, landed like a bomb on the whole field of psychiatry. 3 things I need you to watch for, because each is more unsettling than the last. First, what happened the instant they were inside? The trap that turned every normal thing they did into proof of madness. Second, just how disturbingly hard it became to get back out, and the chilling condition they had to accept to be released. And third, the twist that only came to light decades later. Powerful evidence that this world-famous experiment might itself be an elaborate hoax, that the study exposing lies was itself a lie. Let's start with how easy it was to get labeled insane. Here's all it took to be diagnosed as seriously mentally ill. Each of the 8 pseudo-patients showed up at a hospital and reported just one strange symptom. They said they'd been hearing a voice, an unclear voice that seemed to say 3 words: empty, hollow thud. That was it. That was the entire fake symptom. They deliberately chose those words because they didn't match any known mental illness. They were vague, existential, the kind of thing tied to questions like, what does my life even mean? And crucially, other than that one invented detail, the pseudo-patients told the complete truth. They gave a false name and job to protect their real records. But every other thing about their lives, their relationships, their childhoods, their genuine ups and downs, was completely honest and completely normal. And the result? Every single one of them was admitted, on the strength of 3 whispered words. Most were diagnosed with schizophrenia, one of the most serious psychiatric labels there is. Not, let's observe you for a bit. Not, come back if it continues. Admitted, hospitalized, and stamped with a major mental illness. Now, you could argue that's a reasonable caution. Someone reporting hallucinations probably should be taken seriously. And that's fair. But remember, Rosenhan's real test wasn't whether they'd get in. It was whether, once inside, surrounded by trained professionals watching them every day, anyone would ever notice that these people were completely, obviously sane. Because the moment they walked through that door, the pseudo-patients did something that should have made the truth impossible to miss. They stopped pretending. Entirely. They became exactly who they really were. Normal, healthy people. And that's when the real horror began, because the label they'd just been given started to bend reality itself. Once they were inside and acting completely normal, something chilling happened. The staff didn't see normal people. They saw schizophrenics, because that's what the label told them they were looking at. And so every ordinary thing the pseudo-patients did got quietly reinterpreted as a symptom of the illness they'd been labeled with. This is a psychological force called confirmation bias, and this experiment is its darkest showcase. Once you believe something about a person, your mind stops neutrally observing them and starts hunting for evidence that you were right, twisting anything neutral to fit. The examples are almost unbelievable. One pseudo-patient, bored on the ward, was quietly taking notes about his experience, a completely rational thing to do. A nurse recorded it in his file as pathological writing behavior, a sign of his disturbance. Normal pacing from boredom was logged as anxiety. When they were early for lunch, it was written up as the oral acquisitive nature of their syndrome. And their honest normal life stories, the true accounts of ordinary childhoods, got subtly rewritten by staff to sound like the troubled origins of a mentally ill person. Nothing they actually did mattered. The label had become a lens, and through that lens, sanity itself looked like a symptom. But here is the single most damning detail of the entire study, the one that should give you chills. The staff, the trained experts, never caught on. But the other patients, the actual psychiatric patients on the ward, frequently did. They'd approach the pseudo-patients and say things like, "You're not crazy, you're a journalist or a professor. You're checking up on the hospital." The people who were supposedly insane could see the truth clearly. The professionals paid to detect it could not. Because the patients judged the pseudo-patients by their actual behavior, while the staff judged them by the label on the file. And once you've been labeled, it turns out getting anyone in charge to see the real you becomes almost impossible. As they were about to discover, getting out was even harder. You'd think escaping would be simple. Just tell them the truth. "I'm fine, I feel normal, I'm not hearing any voices anymore." But this is where the trap snapped fully shut, because insisting you're sane is itself treated as a symptom. Think about the logic the label creates. A mentally ill person who denies being ill is showing lack of insight, a classic sign of the disease. So when the pseudo-patients calmly explained they were fine, that calm denial was just filed as more evidence of their condition. There was no move available to them that could win. Claiming sanity was proof of insanity. They were trapped in a system where the label could absorb any evidence against it. So how did they finally get out? Not by convincing anyone they were sane. They got out by doing the opposite, by giving up, agreeing that they were mentally ill, accepting that they needed treatment, and playing the role of a recovering patient. They had to confirm the label to escape it. On average, these perfectly healthy people were held for 19 days. One of them was kept for 52. And here's the final twist of the knife. Not one of them was ever discharged as sane or healthy or released, mistake made. They were discharged with schizophrenia in remission, meaning the system never once admitted it had been wrong. It simply decided the illness had gone temporarily quiet. The label walked out the door with them, permanently stamped on their record. Then came the part that humiliated psychiatry most. When the results came out, one hospital was outraged and insisted they would never be fooled so easily. So Rosenhan issued a challenge. Over the next few months, he'd send them one or more pseudo-patients, see if you can spot them. The hospital went on high alert and confidently flagged 41 of their new patients as suspected fakes. There was just one problem. Rosenhan had sent them no one, not a single pseudo-patient. Every fake they'd caught was a real person seeking help. And with that, Rosenhan seemed to have proven his point twice over. These hospitals couldn't tell the sane from the insane in either direction. The study became legendary, and it helped force a massive overhaul of how mental illness is diagnosed. It looked airtight. But decades later, someone finally checked Rosenhan's homework, and what she found may unravel the whole thing. Decades after the study, a journalist named Susanna Cahalan set out to write a book celebrating it. And she was the perfect person to tell it, because she herself had once been misdiagnosed, her own real physical illness mistaken for a psychiatric one. She believed deeply in Rosenhan's message. She got access to his private papers, expecting to find the rich, detailed records behind a landmark experiment. Instead, she found something that made her stomach drop. The deeper she dug, the more the study fell apart in her hands. First, the pseudo-patients. There were supposedly 8 of them. After an exhaustive search, Cahalan could only ever verify that 2 had actually existed, Rosenhan himself and one other. The other 6, she could find no trace of them at all. No records, no identities, nothing. Leading her to a staggering possibility, that some or even most of the pseudo-patients were simply invented. Then she found Rosenhan's own hospital admission record, the real paperwork from when he had himself committed, and it flatly contradicted his published account. In the paper, Rosenhan claimed he'd been admitted on that one trivial symptom, the harmless voice saying thud. But his actual record showed he'd told the doctors far more alarming things, that he was having suicidal thoughts, and that he was hearing things through radio waves that made his life feel meaningless. In other words, he described exactly the kind of serious distress that should get someone admitted. His admission wasn't a shocking failure of the system. It may have been the system working correctly. On symptoms he later hid from his readers, and then the detail that removes any doubt about his honesty. Cahalan found a real pseudo-patient named Harry Lando, who had genuinely done the experiment. But Lando's experience didn't fit Rosenhan's dark story, because Lando found his hospital stay supportive, calming, even positive. So what did Rosenhan do with that inconvenient data? He threw it out. He excluded Lando from the study entirely. In his notes about Lando's positive experience, someone had written simply, "He likes it." It didn't match the thesis, so it vanished. Cherry-picked data, contradicted records, pseudo-patients who may never have existed, a famous study and resting on the same shaky foundation. Years later, a respected historian of psychiatry reviewed it all and gave his analysis a brutal title, calling it successful scientific fraud. Sit with the full irony of that. the most famous experiment about how psychiatry couldn't be trusted to tell truth from fiction may itself have been fiction. The study about deceptions was quite possibly a deception. So if the study might be fake, was any of it real? Yes, and this is where you need to be careful in two directions, because the wrong lesson here is genuinely dangerous. First, the wrong lesson. Do not walk away thinking mental illness isn't real, or psychiatry is a scam, or never trust a diagnosis. That's the reckless overreaction Rosenhan study helped fuel decades ago. And it did. Real harm, pushing vulnerable, genuinely suffering people away from help they needed. Mental illness is absolutely real. Diagnosis and treatment save lives every day. The journalist who exposed the fraud, Kahalan, is living proof it cuts both ways. She survived because doctors eventually found the real illness behind her symptoms. So the message is not distrust mental health care. Please hear that clearly. Now the lesson that is real and genuinely useful to you. Because whether or not Rosenhan faked his study, the force it dramatized is completely real and proven many times over, the terrifying power of a sticky label. Once a label gets attached to a person, crazy, leer, difficult, troublemaker, failure, criminal, people stop seeing the person and start seeing the label. They filter everything through it. Your good behavior becomes manipulation. Your calm becomes, or your protest becomes proof. And the cruelest part, the real trap, the harder you try to disprove the label, the more it can look like you're confirming it. This doesn't just happen in hospitals. It happens in workplaces, where one bad reputation colors everything you do afterward. In families, where you're forever cast as the problem child. In the justice system, in friendships. Anywhere a label gets stuck before the truth does. So here's what you take from this. Be extremely careful about the labels you slap on other people. Because once you do, you may stop actually seeing them and start seeing only your assumption. Stay open to the evidence that you're wrong about someone. And if an unfair label has been stuck on you, understand the trap you're in. Arguing louder usually feeds it. What breaks a sticky label isn't protest, it's time, consistent behavior, and finding the people willing to look at you with fresh eyes, past the file, past the assumption. The people on that ward who saw the truth weren't the experts. They were the ones who bothered to look at the actual human being. So here's what stays with me from the Rosenhan experiment, even now that we know it might be a lie. The nightmare it captured is real. A label, once it sticks, can rewrite everything about you, until the truth of who you actually are becomes almost impossible for anyone to see. And the people most certain they can judge you correctly are often the ones seeing you least clearly. Because they're reading the label, not the person. And there's a final strange gift buried in this whole story. The study taught the world to question the experts and doubt an official verdict. And then that very study turned out to deserve exactly the same scrutiny. Which is the real lesson, isn't it? Question the label, question the story, even the famous one, especially the famous one. Don't let a label, theirs or yours, do your thinking for you. Look at the person, look at the evidence, and stay willing to be proven wrong. If this one made you think, the next goes even deeper into how the mind gets trapped by what it's told. Subscribe and let's keep pulling these threads. This is Never Heard About.